I'm on the board member of the Idaho Children's Trust Fund, and I want to welcome you to this very important session today. And we have a fabulous speaker here who's going to, Corey Best, don't forget the B, and he's going to talk to us about issues of structural racism and other issues around diversity. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing this. So thank you, Corey. I'll let you get started.
Well, thank you so much, Robin, and good morning to everybody. So we have about an hour and 15 minutes to really cram in just about 402 years and a few weeks worth of history, right? and that's just if we start at 1619. Some of us will go back to 1419 and some a little further than that, but I'll just go ahead and share a few slides with you, and I'm so excited to have the invite today to be a part of the conversation with you. And what we'll do today, once I get to my screen share here, is we will have an opportunity to meaningfully reflect on, let me move my slide, here we go. So we'll have an opportunity today to reflect on race and racism in the US historically, and the racialized impact on our policies and practices, not just specifically to child welfare. It'll be a broader scope today. We'll explore the idea of race and how that has informed our ideology. And hopefully, by the end of the day, we'll have an opportunity to build a shared understanding of the positive impact of racial justice and also accountability in our work. And that takes us to some agreements that I'll ask you to really be mindful of as we're having conversations that are meant to really develop us, but some of us believe that these conversations should be hard. Some actually believe we should not be talking about it. And some of us are ahistorical, meaning that, hey, the history is the past and none of that stuff matters. But just about in everything that we do in life, we do trace the past in order to understand how we create and cultivate a better future for ourselves, our families, and our communities. However, when the conversation of race comes up, it's like, let's keep that secret about America way back then. But if we were to say, why do we celebrate the 4th of July? And someone said to the most patriotic young person in the room, hey, that's the past. That's like 1776. Why are you still celebrating that? The argument would be quite different, right? So we pick and choose what we want to talk about, how and when we want to talk about something. But the fact remains, and there's a lot of evidence, the fact remains that we are a racialized country. And in a state such as Idaho, I wonder if anyone has ever really asked themselves the question, what is the legacy of Idaho when it comes to colonization? What is the legacy of Idaho when it comes to interracial marriages and the outlaw and the bans there? And how is Idaho so white? And why are we, right? Nothing against white people, just a question. I wonder if we're actually really interrogating why we're structured in the way we are in our world, right? Specifically in the United States. So that's a lot of information to uncover. And please know that these racial justice norms will help us understand that this is a process, right? The journey toward equity, the journey toward justice is indeed a value and also an outcome. But the process is really what's important for us to be mindful of, that there isn't a quick fix. I'm a firm believer that this work requires us to think laterally. I will not provide you with a toolkit. I don't have a guide or a set of check boxes for you. The work, in my experience, requires a deep level of commitment to learn, to begin to coalesce with others, and also to be willing to challenge yourselves, your worldview as to why you think a certain way, and also to utilize historical occurrences to form future strategies when it comes to making justice the way we do our work, as opposed to justice being another thing that we have to work toward, right? So in order to get there, just for today, I encourage you to embrace, speak your truth, share stories, experiences, thoughts. We will have a moment or two. Well, I'll open up to the group in just a moment. And also at the back end of our conversation, we'll have some small group dialogue based on a scenario. I want you to lean into the discomfort and into one another, right? This signals that you are being challenged and even perhaps growing in your understanding, and you can impart wisdom to others. Embrace the paradox. In this movement, in this work, this mindset requires us to think about and both, as opposed to either or. Like the either or thinking can really stymie the learning process. And I think we've seen that in systems change overall, not just with justice, right? We have polarities, we have different worldviews. Think about trauma and ACEs and that a whole bucket of work, right? There was a lot required of us to stretch and think about how we serve one another, things that have happened to us, and how that impacts the future. We could not do that with just one right way, right? So the either or thinking does indeed stymie the learning and the change that we're looking for. Seek intentional learning, not perfection. In our country, we have been one of punitive to a degree where, we grade ourselves, right? You won't get a grade today. Everybody here comes in at a 10, regardless of your learning, regardless of your worldview, regardless of your own isms or lack of awareness, right? There's nothing perfect in this world. We created an imperfect America, and we're all imperfect beings trying to get better each and every day. So the way we do that is seek intentional learning. Change does not happen in a linear, a sort of discrete, isolated way, right? Massive change, social movements happens together with one another, in community, in partnership. Commit to non-closure. Even with tangible goals, action steps, there's always more to learn. More will be required, more information, your ahas, your brain pops, the way you see things, the things you question. Once you see, it's hard to unsee, and stay engaged in the process and the dialogue along the way. Now, what I'd like to do is this is an opportunity for me to get to know you a little more. I would love to ask everyone, if they could, or anyone, to let me understand your definition of race. What does race mean to you? What is race? Cam has dropped a glossary of terms that I'll encourage you to utilize along your journey. We don't have to open and unpack that today. Please focus attention into the space. But let me hear one or two individuals just come, unmute yourselves, and help me understand what race means to you. Anyone? You can use the chat. So C1, a cultural construct. Just chat them all in. Maybe we can go 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 and do a chat bomb and get everybody's voice in the space. Equity of voice is something that I aim for. Genetic background. Keep them going. Please feel free to unmute yourselves as well. So I'll give it about 5 to 10 more seconds. Ethnicity and culture, genetics, cultural structures. Race is a way to categorize people based on skin color. Ooh, I like that one. A social construction that has been used as a tool to create social inequality and oppression. Whoa, Robin, let's change places. So all great answers. And as you can see, some of us are leaning toward this notion of a social construct, right? So what I want you to think about when it comes to race, and I'm going to unpack a little bit more in just a moment. But first, to adhere to what is race, I want you to think about race as a species classification, right, of human beings, meaning it's absolutely wrong. It's superficial. You cannot trace biological evidence. We cannot take our blood and determine what race we are. Race is much different than ethnicity, much different than culture. It was created during a period of worldwide colonialism, right? Worldwide takeover and expansion by Europeans who weren't even known as white at the time, right? So by Europeans using themselves as a model for humanity, for the purposes of assigning and maintaining power through white skin and access to privilege and advantages, right? So it's a way to categorize human beings. And I'm going to unpack again more of what that means, because here in these United States, we utilize pseudoscience to justify the treatment of people based on the physical differences and the categorizations. So let me hear this one. I would like for us to be a little more verbal, right? What messages did you receive about your race as a child? Maybe one or two, if you're a brave soul.
For me, it was being lazy and stupid.
Okay, I'm trying to see who's talking.
Oh, sorry. I just turned on my video. That would be me.
And what is your racial identity?
I am Hispanic, Latina.
Okay. And I appreciate your courage there and your vulnerability. Now, may I ask a follow-up question, if you don't mind?
Yes, that's fine.
Does those messages still sort of resonate in our society today about your racial identity and what we've attached to it?
Yes.
And so there's no evidence of that either, right? There's no evidence of
No.
Hispanics being lazy, right? There's no evidence
No.
of, right? And so it's peculiar to me how we have allowed an invention, a man-made invention, to become real, right? So the first lie we told in America is that race is a biological trait, that race can be traced back to genetics, traced back to culture, traced back to region. We know that now to be false. And as I believe Millie just illuminated for us, this notion of worth, value, and who's deemed more powerful based on these bogus categorizations have various harmful messages that we carry with us into this current century, right? So that takes me to the question that we grapple with a lot. What is racism? If we know race, right? So race is a social construct that comes with various messages. We receive those messages in childhood. I receive many non-white children, research says non-white children will understand their racial identity by the time they're 9. Same study, same body of research will say that white individuals typically do not understand that they're a racial category until they're 18 to 25 years old. And the experiences for non-white people between 0 and 9 are overwhelmingly negative experiences, as Millie has just stated. So what is racism?
I would like to say, like, the message that I received about race as a child from the 1st to the 4th grade, I was never questioned about me being a Nez Perce tribal member until we moved to a larger city. And then that's when I experienced racism in the 5th grade by some boy. We were doing PE, and then we were playing boys against the girls softball. And the boy, I was out in the field because I could throw far. And then here he come charging at me, and I sidestepped him, and he fell on the ground, and he said, he called me, you Indian bee. And then that was my first experience with racism.
You know, again, I am really appreciating the rich conversation as well as what the chat is revealing. You know, Shannon states that, you know, she was raised to believe that there's only one race, the human race. And that's an aspiration that we all wish to achieve. You know, the reality is that I teach my son to love, respect everybody, but I also have to teach him about his phenotype, right? So when my son leaves the porch or leaves home, there's a world out there, and it's not victimhood that I teach my son, but there's a world out there that sometimes will treat him differently just based on his skin color. So race is not only a social construct, it has become socially important, right? And we've practiced, and I want this to sink in for a moment. We've practiced oppression and othering similar to racism before the construct of race, right? So when you think about how Europeans began to invent and build this caste system here in America, we were, as a world globally, practicing oppressive tendencies based on elitism, power, and prestige. So racism is definitely a form of social oppression. And what I'd like for you to think about is, one, there's so many definitions about racism and what racism is. I want us to think about it in 4 ways. So I want you to think about a system. I want you to think about design. I want you to think about advantage. And I want you to think about social and institutional power. Because we get hung up on, I am such a good person, I have Black friends, I have white friends, I have mixed children, I have never used a negative racial expletive ever in my life. All of those things are wonderful. We don't want you to do any of that. We want you to keep having your Black friends and getting proximate to people. But that does not exclude you from being a part of a system that perpetuates racial inequities. And so racism is created more by systems than it is by people. And of course, people make up the system. So we can't isolate, we can't interrogate racism in just one dimension. We must begin to think about it in both the interpersonal and also the institutional dimension. So true to form, racism is defined as social institutional power. It's sort of like a formula, right? Social and institutional power combined with race prejudice, a system of advantages for those who are considered white. And I say those who are considered white because race is not real, but it's socially important, and it's also become legally important. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And oppression for those who are not considered white. it is a system of white supremacy, a white supremacy mindset, a mindset of superiority. I know that term white supremacy is hard for some to swallow, but I'm not talking about overt acts of racism here. I'm not talking about neo-Nazism, the Ku Klux Klan, right? I'm talking about a mindset that says throughout history that the messages I receive about my race is that I'm less than, and the messages I receive about your race is that you're more than, and the data can prove it when we see the outcomes across all systems from early education to sports and entertainment. That white and black become the bookends and all other races are in the middle, right? White's always faring well, and we cannot attribute that to cultural beliefs, behaviors, and impulses, such as the brilliant Carl Linnaeus tried to do in the 1700s. And so he wasn't the first pseudoscientist to try to explain away racial categories, but I bring up Carl Linnaeus for a reason. So he categorized human beings in these 5 areas, right? Europeanus, Asiaticus, Americanus, Monstrous, and Africanus, right? This was sort of like the second swipe. The first guy who did it was 1684, Francois Bernier. And what Carlos Linnaeus did was he set up this hierarchy caste system that says Europeans are sanguine, pale, muscular, clever, inventive, governed by law, right? That our Asian brothers and sisters are melancholic, yellow, inflexible, severe, right? Dark-eyed, governed by opinion. And please note who Americans were and are, right? So Carlos Linnaeus and other European scientists recognized the Native Americans were Americans, right? The first nation, the first peoples here. And you can see that they were deemed to be caloric, combative, governed by customs, right? So think about traditions and assimilation when you begin to see what we do and how we've colonized America through the legacy of theft of land and taken over and created what was a brown and red world to now become a more white and superior world, right? So these are pieces of history that we must understand because it gives us opportunity to see how I, even in white body or black body, can change the trajectory and the dynamic of a space, right? So this monstrous phase where people who had multiple identities, and then Africanus, as you can see the bookends, every European pseudoscientist were able to come back and deem Europeans as the top, more clever. And you see Africanus here, phlegmatic, black, slow, relaxed, negligent. And so when you think about the way Millie helped us, she started us off, right? She started us off by saying that these messages, now, this was 1707 to 1708, his life. 1684, Francois Bernier was the first person to really begin to categorize. Now, these same messages, whether we see it, think it, or not, are rampant in all of our systems. And it shows up in our policies and our behaviors and the way that we treat people today, all because of a man-made invention. Now, what I'd like for you all to do is I want to get us a little more involved in the conversation today. We're going to do something that's called flip the script. Did you all see the Monopoly board there? So I'm usually asked, Corey, how do you explain racism to a predominantly white state in an hour and 15 minutes? I say I play a game of Monopoly, right? So we know a game of Monopoly cannot last for just an hour and 15 minutes. It's like one of the longest games God's ever created, right? So what I want you to do is to engage into this space with me. you'll need to utilize your Zoom functions. So when you go to your participant button, I want you to rename yourself. So it's 54 of you. We can do this all at the same time. I want you to rename yourself. And what I'd like for you to do, if you're comfortable, but if you agree to the process norms, then leaning into the discomfort is okay, right? But I'd like for you to rename yourself as just your racial identity. Just your racial identity: Hispanic, Pacific Islander, Asian, African American, or Black, Indigenous, white. Just your racial identity. And when you get there, there's a step 2. So once you rename yourself, and Cam, maybe you can give a quick version of where to find that, just in case people are a little stuck.
Yeah, of course. If you scroll over your own photo or your own video, a little ellipses will pop up, the 3 dots in the right-hand corner. Just click on those ellipses and you can scroll down to the very bottom. It says rename. Click on that and then you'll have the ability to rename. And if you want to send me a message, if you can't find it, I can rename you myself for you. So just send me a message if you have trouble finding it.
And Jay, I'm appreciating your comment about the fear piece and Japanese internment, because as we know, America has been all about radical exclusion, even through the first 1790 Immigration Act, right? So that still resonates with us today. And it's also amazing to me to think about, why did America only conquer just pieces of Mexico, right? Why didn't we take like all of Mexico? Maybe there was fear of becoming a brown country. Who knows? But there's some research out there for you to do to find out on your own. But immigration really runs deep into the identity piece, and we'll talk a little bit more if time permits. So now that you have your racial identity, Charlotte, would you care to play with us? Okay, so when you have your racial identity renamed, well, yourself renamed as your racial identity, let's go stop the camera for a second, because now we're going to enter into a game of Monopoly. Everybody just stop your camera for just a few seconds while we play this game of Monopoly.
If you need to stop your camera, you can just click on the stop video or start video down at the bottom. And a couple of you have just texted me with your update, so give me a second and I'll work on that.
All right, cool. Let me know when you're all set, and we'll get in. I will accelerate after this game, but I think it's important for us to begin to experience a long legacy of history. I am seeing a BETZNEGL. Would you be able to rename yourself as your racial identity? Okay, so here we are. Now, what I'd like for you to do is to think about, we're going to do an abridged version, maybe 10 minutes of a 3-hour Monopoly game. And what I'd like to have happen right now is for those who identify Black, Native, to rejoin us with your camera. African American or Native Indigenous Americans, please unblock your camera.
And again, to do that, you're just going to go down to your participant toolbar and click on the camera. Just click on that and it'll start your video.
Are there any indigenous, Native, or African Americans in our space today?
I am, but it won't let me put my camera back on. It says the host has stopped my video.
Okay, try now. There you are. Okay. So let's imagine for a moment that the game Monopoly has started and that she is able to buy, build, structure, organize societal norms. And she has opportunity to cultivate land as she sees fit. And often that was through oppressive tactics. And that's the first hour of Monopoly. Then the second hour of Monopoly, I would like for Latina, Latinx, Pacific Islanders, and or Asian individuals to unblock your cameras. So now the second hour of Monopoly begins, and we have Hispanics, Asians, Mexican Americans, Latinx are now a part of the game after the second hour of Monopoly. And through this second hour of Monopoly, they are then invited by Nez Perce into this space, invited and given a few rules that some may have to assimilate to what she's already structured as societal norms, but they also have an opportunity to utilize a little bit of power because they're more like her. She has agreed to this compromise, so to speak. Now, within that second hour, Latina, Latinx, Pacific Islanders, Asian individuals are able to do something that many people need to build and amass wealth. And that is to buy property. And that is to also get invited into the labor force. You following me so far? That's the second hour of Monopoly. Now, the third hour of Monopoly, I want all white people to come and join the game. What's left on the board? By the third hour of Monopoly, what's left on the board for you?
Nothing.
Not much.
Not much. And there's a few things, you know, so Nez Perce and my Asian brother and my Hispanic sister, you know, we've devised a plan too, right? So part of that plan is that we're going to sell you some things that you can't afford. And we're also going to utilize you for commodity and to increase our capitalistic worldview, right? And when you are allowed, because we have already structured the rules, when you are allowed to rent, it's going to be at a really high price, and it's going to be in some very hostile conditions that we've created intentionally. So you're absolutely right. It's very little left on that board after 3 hours of Monopoly. Now, I ask you to sit with that for just a moment as we think about why it's so easy for us to say that these things have nothing to do with the past. But I want to ask anyone who came into the game in the third hour, what's the likelihood that you are going to amass wealth at the same rate as Nez Perce, Mexican, Hispanic, Latina, Latinx, Asian individuals, what's the likelihood that you're going to amass that amount of wealth at the same rate, starting the game in the third hour?
Very unlikely.
So again, history has more to do with the present. Racial inequities cannot be explained away by behavioral or cultural occurrences. The system that Nez Perce and all other non-white individuals set up are predictors for your white people coming into the game 3 hours late, are predictors for the trajectory of your lives. Greater predictors. Now, of course, some of you are going to excel. Some of you are going to exceed. Some of you are a little more brown, like the first two founders or colonizers in this earth, right? Some of you are exceptional, as we like to believe. But I'll tell you what, that hard work, grit alone cannot get you to the wealth that Nez Perce and all the other non-white individuals got to, because the playing field was never level. So you have an opportunity to engage in the workforce, but it's only with the rules that we have set up for you. And so that takes us back to this design, right? Design, advantage, social and institutional power. And we think about our system of inequities as history creates our culture shapes our identity, and it's driven by power and economics. So if we utilize the game of Monopoly, we could see for just this clear in 15 minutes that Nez Perce and non-white individuals utilize power to set structures, norms, institutions, values that are shaped and formed in a worldview about what people's otherness is and are based on the invention of race. So race is about value and worth, and they had an opportunity to structure and design these United States as they saw fit. And so what we focus on more, unfortunately, is the internal piece. And it's important for us to understand what we feel about others, how we treat others, but the advantages and the biases and the internalized racism doesn't always make up the structures. Those things come with us, but the structure is the first 2 hours of the Monopoly game. That's the structure. Some of the non-white people who were engaged in the second hour of the Monopoly game became part of the institution because of the agreements for livelihood and also survival. Because of the agreements of survival, they were a part of the institution, and we bring how we feel about others into this work. So this infinity circle is driven by power and economics, because a thread, an anchor of racism was and still is to eradicate cross-racial solidarity, right? And when we think about the late 1700s into the 1800s with laws, we see that it was to eradicate cross-racial workforce solidarity. Now, to break it down in another way, we can think about it in chunks of time, right? So we have, we're in 2021. If we stopped at 2019, just for an example, right? So most of us are in this conversation because of the country's pressure and energy around equity, justice, and equality, and things that we have sort of hidden for a long time and just unaware of, and it's not our fault. We did not create the first 2 hours of Monopoly, right? We didn't create this structure, but it's left up to us to try to do something different and better because of it. So do we just not pick up popsicle sticks when they're on the ground because somebody else littered, right? I think it's incumbent upon us to realize that sometimes we have to clean up other people's messes. And the messes that we're attempting to clean up are the messes of our forefathers, of our founding fathers, of our ancestors. Those messes leave legacies. And between 1607, 1619 to 1964, we saw 246 years if we go up to 2019. 246 years of chattel slavery. Now, I'm not a mathematician, but let's just do a little math together. That's 62% of our country's history was spent between 1619 to 1865, 246 years chattel slavery. Another 100 years, our country was in legalized Jim Crow, no citizenship laws between 1865 and 1965. That's another 25% of our country's history. Now, 1965 to 2019, well, to 2021 even, is 56 years. We collectively, on this Zoom platform, haven't been out of legalized slavery, Jim Crow, slave codes, lynching, longer than our ancestors have collectively been in or were in. We're not even out a century. And so what happened in the civil rights era was that we went from very color conscious in 1963, very color conscious, right? Color only signs, whites only signs, the laws in Idaho where people couldn't marry one another, right? Like those kinds, that level of consciousness. To 1965, we went to color blind. I don't see color any longer. We're not allowed to call people names in public places, and that there's this equity of opportunity. Well, all of that fuels our frame. And I'm gonna speed this up a little bit because I want you all to get into a conversation with one another. So everything that we've just talked about sort of fuels our framing, and we haven't even talked about policies such as GI Bill and FHA and immigration laws, and how affirmative action really benefited white women more than it benefited any other racialized group of people. But there's a narrative of affirmative action that's saying we're giving people of color hands up, right? So our framing, put yourself for just a moment into that, that photographer that you like to be around the holidays and what you share on social media. You share what you want to share based on your worldview. You leave out so much more out of the frame, and that's okay. But where I'm going is what we just talked about fuels and becomes our ideology. The ideology of race are our values, our beliefs, our assumptions, and our norms that Nez Perez and all the non-white individuals Nez Perce got an opportunity to create from the very beginning, right? So those values and beliefs become a part of our worldview. And when we have that worldview, we begin to craft messages based on our ideology. Some of those messages comes out in ways that how we describe people, how we define individuals or communities, in fact, and how we define whole groups of racialized individuals. How whiteness in white individuals becomes individualized, but all non-white individuals are collectivized, right? They do this, they do that. They made this choice. But we also, in our messaging, we fuel this notion of who's deemed worthy or more deserving of goods, services, opportunities, right? And so when we begin to think about this, we have to see that poor communities and communities of color are often under siege by systems and institutions that offer goods and services, but will never share power, right? And we need an audience for this. So our audience sometimes are our funders. Our audience sometimes are our families. Our audience sometimes are our legislators, right? The public perception. If you're thinking about CPS, the whole notion of foster and adoption, separating children who need to be rescued from their parents and put into a better, more affluent, oftentimes more whiter environments. We can look at the legacy of orphan trains in the 1800s. We can look at, wow, where were Black kids in the 1800s? They were actually on the slave plantation, and therefore child protection for them wasn't even a considered option until like the 60s. Like, whoa, who's the audience for this ideology, this message, this audience? We need an audience. We need an audience for our ideology and our messages, because those are individuals who reinforce the narrative of superiority and inferiority. And as we grow up as children, we begin to see how other people, other groups of people are treated by authority, right? If it's not questioned, if our parents don't have the savvy, the wherewithal, the know-withal to teach us about history, we're left to our own devices to say, well, that's not how people who look like me live, so it must be a them problem, not a system problem. And the audience continues to fuel it. But I'll tell you what, we distribute these messages in various ways, even in the things that we don't talk about. What we don't talk about in recruitment, what we don't talk about in training, what we don't teach in schools, what we have not yet to touch on when it comes to adverse childhood experiences. We cannot be trauma informed if we're not race and oppression informed. Period. Full stop. Corey said it. Full stop. We have to not consider ourselves trauma informed any longer unless we're race informed, because that gives us an opportunity to tell just a single story. While we tell a single story of what's happening in a familial dynamic, we're not also telling a fuller, broader picture of how our systems have positioned individuals into places through things like restrictive covenants, things like segregated states, right? Things like telling the story of what a person is without telling the story of actually the systems that have helped to get them there. That is oppressive. And we leave that part of the story out when it comes to the adverse childhood experiences. So there's a level up opportunity there. And, without power, we can't distribute the message. So we have an ideology, we have a message, we know our audiences, and this is not intentional. It's cyclical, it's natural. If you understand a system, it is seamless. It's supposed to work this way. You can look at a diagram today of a plumbing system and see how convoluted and twisted it looks. But my golly, how do I just turn on the water and it goes out that way? It's seamless. It's by design that it's that way. And we also need a power source and resources to pump the ideology and the messages. And that power typically comes from even Black leaders, right? So even Black leaders or brown leaders, or Asian leaders are consumed with whiteness in their organization because of how the structure was already set up from with Nez Perce in the beginning of the Monopoly game. If we go back there, that was the power. That white dominant, her indigenous dominant lead becomes the structure. And so to go to the reality, that was a flip the script moment. In reality, white colonized, that became the white dominant led political structure. The court structures, our institutions are structured that way. Our practices are structured that way. We don't question the policies. And unfortunately, we have to look at it systemically, because if we look at making one institution better, well, what about the rest of the state? What about the rest of the community? What about the rest of the institutions? So we are, due to the invention of race, we are structurally interconnected. The schools work with CPS, the CPS works with nonprofits, and it's cyclical, right? All to a degree carrying the same ideology, delivering the same messages to the same audience, and similar distribution methods. And we often get our power sources from the same place: Fed, government, legislation, state, right? Those things fuel our ability to continue with the false narrative. And through that narrative, we made race real. But the beauty is, like all systems, systems of oppression, inequality, and inequity are by design, therefore can be redesigned. I'd like for you all to take a moment to read this scenario, and then I'm going to break you out in maybe 2 5-minute groups, 2 to 5 minute groups, just to get you sort of talking. I'll read it out loud. I sometimes visualize, or that it should read visualize. I sometimes visualize an ongoing cycle of racism as a moving walkway at the airport. Active racist behavior is equivalent to walking fast on the conveyor belt. The person engaged in active racist behavior has identified with the ideology of white supremacy and is moving with it. Passive racist behavior is equivalent to standing on the walkway. No overt effort is being made, but the conveyor belt moves the bystanders along to the same destination as those who are actively walking. Some of the bystanders may feel the motion of the conveyor belt, see the active racists ahead of them, and choose to turn around, unwilling to go to the same destination as the white supremacists. But unless they're walking actively in the opposite direction at a speed faster than the conveyor belt, unless they are actively anti-racist, they will find themselves carried along with others. Think about that metaphor for a moment. And I'm going to give us some questions to ponder. While I copy and paste the questions, I wonder if there are any thoughts and ahas, and just in, so group, how many groups do we have, Cam?
We're going to have about 11 groups.
11 groups, okay, that is perfect. So I tell you, almost nothing is by accident. I have 11 questions. How about that, right? So I am going to give you these 11 questions if my Control V would ever work for me. So here we go. I'm going to put those 11 questions in the chat. I would appreciate if you could copy it, because we don't know what breakout room you're going to be in just yet, but it just goes right in sequential order. Group 1, answer first question 2 through 11. How about that? And then we'll just build the story that way. That seems to work for me, right? And just have a conversation about your question. Thinking about the metaphor, and then I'll give you 8 minutes and we'll come back, and I think we'll start to wrap up with the last 10 minutes and hear a couple of popcorn reflections about today and also your conversation. Are you saying you don't see the information in the chat? Enter would help. There it is.
Yeah, there it is.
All right. So Questions before we break? Good. All right, just one question, one group's like the easiest breakout in the world, right? Let's go for it. Cam, you want me to do it? There it is. I'll bring it back in about 9 minutes.
I've got a timer, Corey, for 8
Perfect.
minutes, and then I'll bring them back.
Thank you. It's
So
a
for
lot of
those of-
information.
For those of you that are still in the room, you should have gotten an invite to join a breakout room. You're just gonna look for that. I think it pops up in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. And off you will go. If you're having any trouble finding that button, you can just let me know. Looks like there's still a handful of people in the room. If you are having any trouble finding your breakout room invitation, just come on video real fast and I can walk you through it. Or there's a group that's having a problem, so I'm gonna go join them in their room. Hey, Corey, are you there? Hey, Crystal. Folks are in breakout rooms right now discussing a question. If you want to join a breakout room, I can toss you into one. Otherwise, folks will be coming back in about 5 minutes. Okay, thanks, Crystal. Corey, did you see my message? Are you okay if I put that in the chat once
Yeah,
everybody
go
comes
for it.
back? Okay.
Absolutely.
I can't rejoin a breakout room, I guess, but it's fine. Sorry, I'm having a little breakfast. I just let them know that there's 1 minute left, so I'm going to go ahead and close the rooms.
Now, I have seen a big change in my husband over the years because, we got married later in life, second marriage, and he would just say things would come out of his mouth like I could.
It looks like we're almost at full capacity. Maybe a couple have left us. So again, a lot of information. Most of this is not new stuff. This is not an opinion. These are evidence-informed talking points. And I also like to put in the chat just some key terms to help you focus, I would say, your journey. So the piece of history that we've landed on today is sort of the invention of race. That'll take you, these terms will give you enough information, fact check your sources, and also cross-reference your information. These will give you a pretty good common language and a foundation to build on the historical inequities and how that shows up in contemporary world. Before I go any further, I'd just like to know if anybody would like to unmute themselves and tell us what you discussed in your conversation regarding the conveyor belt.
This is Robin. I'll go. We had question number 8. What would it take for you to reverse directions? And so we discussed that we're trying really hard to be going in the opposite direction of the conveyor belt, but we certainly have our slip ups. But I personally don't think anything's going to get me switched to go the other direction. And I'm going to keep on pushing against those slip ups and do my best to fight the direction of that conveyor belt.
Robin, I really appreciate that. And I hope that also resonates with your colleagues and friends from around the state, because there's no perfection in this work, right? We are all human beings. We are fallible. We make mistakes. It's just unfortunate that some mistakes are magnified while others aren't, right? So in all racial categories, there's both, as James Baldwin says, there's both beauty and ugly. And we tend to sometimes only magnify the ugly, especially for those that have been oppressed, and that term slip ups, right? We don't know if we've slipped, made a misstep until we step in it. So that's where the courage comes in, right? We have to go beyond our historical thinking about what's right and wrong in this conversation. I think that there's some things that are glaringly obvious we shouldn't do, right? I mean, right? But there's some nuances to how we behave with one another that requires us to sort of fail and fail harder the next time. So I appreciate that. One more.
I'll share. I'll build off a little bit of what Robin was talking about as well. So our question was number 4, we were group 4, what does the conveyor belt symbolize? And we talked about several things, like it being the, symbolizing the overall kind of institution and system of racism. And, with that, one of the questions we really tried to talk about was where is the power of the conveyor belt coming from? And, with Robin saying that she's turning around the other way, it almost feels like the people on the conveyor belt don't have control of the power, and we're forced to just kind of, there's only one route for us. We're not given another route. And if we do want to turn around, it takes a lot of pushback against who's behind you and who might be trying to come through. And it's a lot of, they make it to where that's not necessarily, the power of the conveyor belt is making it to where that's not necessarily the easy choice. And although it is the right choice for many of us, that doesn't, they make it seem like more isolating almost for those that do want change.
And, you're elevating a common challenge, right? Power seems to be invisible. And it's also quite visible when we become aware of who we are and how we're structured in the world, right? Resistance is a part of justice. No movement has come by just accepting. And if you think about white and black as the bookends, think about the past year's riots. I mean, just as an example, Black people are often given a message that they should suffer peacefully, right? Don't make a fuss, right? And even pro-Black and white anti-racists are encouraged to do the same. Don't make such a big fuss, just keep it quiet, and we'll get to it when we can, right? And I think there's always this sit back and wait for the energy to die down. But I'll just say firmly, Tabor, that the movement lies in the people, right? That one individual can do something, but one individual can't do it all. It takes aligning yourselves with like-minded people to really push to something different. I mean, just look at what you may have done in your state to change mindsets, affix that to justice. I'm thinking about trauma, right? It was just in the 95 that we took fun out of dysfunction, right? And started talking about the ways that we behaved in family. So I know we're on a time crunch here, and I'm just going to wrap up really quick with just a closing. So the brutal, troubled history of the idea of race really clearly demonstrates the power of ideologies about human difference. The idea that the world's population can be divided into discrete racial groups is a product of another specific series of events that comes with colonialism through scientific racism, and I've given you those terms. To rationalize this desire to take land from indigenous people in the Americas and to extract labor from African Europeans, develop ideologies of inferiority, right? Alongside this large-scale theft of land and exploration of labor, science began to emerge as a field of study concerned largely with the classifications of all objects into specific groups. Scientists rushed this taxonomy of flora and fauna, including the classifications of humans. And this is where we are today. So we cannot simply look at the past and point fingers at those races of yesteryear. Instead, we should also be compelled to explore the assumptions and the ideologies that actually govern our behavior today. And I have the utmost faith that you will continue to push forward in this effort. And join us for our cap note this afternoon, where you'll be able to see some of these legacies really come to life and how they manifest in our individuals. So I will say thank you for your time. I'm patting myself on the back because I'm just like 1 minute over, and that never happens for me, right? So.
And I think for those of you that are curious, Corey said he would get us a version of his slides later today. So look on the Padlet for that to be available maybe tomorrow. And there's also a recording of this that'll be available next week. And Roger will be communicating with you all about when and how and where that's available. So thank you so much, Corey. And
thank you all. I really appreciate it.
Gonna drop the link to where we need to be next, our networking session. So you all can just click on that and head right over. There you go.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Just click on that link in the chat and we'll see you at the networking session.